one reality. There is the world of Joseph Goebbels, films of iron-willed supermen and monstrous enemies, a doctrine of hate projected onto massive screens for the masses. In another, there is the world of Hollywood, Charlie Chaplin mocking dictators, Ginger Rogers dancing her way to freedom, and cowboys carving out their own destiny. What happens when soldiers forged in the First World are forcibly seated to watch the Second? This is the story of a forgotten front in World War II, where the most potent weapon was not a bomb, but a film reel. To understand the power of this weapon, one must first step into the mind of its target. Imagine a young German soldier, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, huddled in the dust of North Africa or the frozen mud of the Ardennes in 1944. For his entire conscious life, his reality has been shaped by a single, monolithic narrative. He has been told that he is a part of a master race, destined for victory. He has watched newsreels portraying the German war machine as an unstoppable force of nature, and his enemies as subhuman, weak, and corrupt. The Americans in particular were painted as a decadent society of gangsters and jazz musicians, a nation too soft and racially impure to wage a real war. His Führer had promised a 1,000-year Reich, and Joseph Goebbels provided the soundtrack and the moving pictures to make that promise feel inevitable. The films he watched were not for entertainment. They were tools of indoctrination. They depicted stoic, self-sacrificing heroes, a nation united in singular purpose, and a world that would rightfully belong to them. There was no room for doubt, no space for individualism, no tolerance for frivolous humor. The world was a grim, serious struggle, and he was a warrior forged for it. Then came the moment of rupture, the deafening roar of artillery, the shriek of incoming shells, the chaos of a collapsing front line. The war, in its raw and terrifying reality, was nothing like the glorious newsreels. And then, surrender. Hands raised, heart pounding, he awaits the fate he has been taught to expect. The American soldiers, these supposed degenerates, will be brutal. Propaganda films had shown them as merciless killers. He expects a rifle butt to the face, summary execution, or at the very least, a descent into a nightmare of starvation and torture. This is the bedrock of his belief system, the final grim certainty in a world turned upside so down. But the blow never comes. Instead, a young man barely older than himself with a strange accent approaches. The American GI is chewing gum, looking exhausted but not hateful. He offers not a fist, but a pack of cigarettes. He points to a canteen offering water. This simple act of humanity is the first powerful psychological shock. It is a gesture that does not compute. It is a kindness that feels more disorienting than cruelty. This dissonance continues as he and his comrades are moved from the front. They are disarmed, searched, and organized with a detached efficiency that is itself unsettling. There is no chaotic rage from their captors, only a methodical process. They are given food, strange packaged rations from a country that was supposedly on the brink of collapse. The journey to the coast begins, and with every mile, the carefully constructed reality of the Third Reich begins to fray. They see an endless convoy of American trucks, a sky filled with American planes, a logistical chain of such overwhelming scale that it silently mocks the German newsreels of enemy weakness. This wasn't a nation of gangsters. This was an industrial titan that could afford to feed its prisoners better than the Wehrmacht could feed its own frontline troops. As they are herded onto transport ships, The final, terrifying rumor is confirmed. They are not being sent to a desolate camp in Britain or Africa. They are being taken across the Atlantic to the United States itself. They are being delivered into the heart of the beast, a land they were taught to despise, but which was now demonstrating a power and a character so alien, so contrary to their indoctrination, that it threatened to annihilate not their bodies, but their very souls. The battle for their minds had begun, and they didn't even know they were on the front line. The journey across the Atlantic was not the brutal passage they had been conditioned to fear. For men accustomed to the cramped, vermin-infested holds of German troop transports, the American ships were a revelation. There was space, sanitation, and something that had become a distant memory: 3 meals a day. It was a period of surreal suspension, a monotonous voyage across an endless ocean that gave them too much time to think. They traded stories, whispered fears, and tried to reconcile the kindness of their captors with the years of indoctrination. The first glimpse of the American coastline was the next profound psychological blow. They had left behind a continent of ruins. Their own cities, Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne, were being systematically pounded into dust and ash. They expected to see an America similarly scarred by the hardships of a world war. Instead, they saw a skyline that was whole, vibrant, and defiantly vertical. The great port cities greeted them not with blackouts and anti-aircraft batteries, but with a dizzying display of life. Skyscrapers clawed at the clouds, harbors were choked with ships, and the streets were filled with civilian automobiles. This was not a nation on its knees. This was a nation that seemed utterly untouched by the conflict it was helping to win. The next stage of their re-education came on rails. Loaded onto trains, the prisoners began a long journey into the American heartland, to the hundreds of camps scattered across the South, Midwest, and West. The windows of these trains became a frame for a picture they could not comprehend. This rolling diorama was a silent, relentless lecture in economic might. They saw endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon, tended not by weary old men and women, but by modern machinery. They passed through small towns where life seemed to be proceeding with an astonishing normalcy. Children played in yards, women hung laundry, and the local movie theater advertised the latest Hollywood pictures. It was a landscape of impossible plenty, a direct visual contradiction of every lie they had been told about the decadent, starving America that was surely on the verge of collapse. The camps themselves delivered the final shock to their system. They expected squalid cages, barbed wire enclosures patrolled by sadistic guards. The barbed wire was there, certainly, but inside was a world of bewildering order and civility. They were assigned to clean wooden barracks, furnished with cots and blankets. There were mess halls, infirmaries staffed with doctors and dentists, and even designated recreational areas. The daily routine was one of military precision, not penal cruelty. Roll calls, work details for which they were paid a small wage, and free time. The most potent form of counter-propaganda was served 3 times a day in the mess hall. The sheer quantity and quality of the food was stupefying. White bread, meat, coffee with sugar, vegetables, even dessert. Luxuries that had vanished from Germany years earlier were standard fare. Under the Articles of the Geneva Convention, these prisoners were to receive rations equivalent to those of the American soldiers guarding them. This policy, a matter of international law, became an unintentional masterstroke of psychological warfare. Every meal was an edible refutation of Goebbels' claims of American weakness. Every clean bunk and visit to the medical clinic chipped away at the image of the brutal enemy. Before the first film projector ever whirred to life, the groundwork for a revolution of the mind was already complete. The prisoners' ideological armor, forged in the fires of Nazi propaganda, had been systematically weakened, not by force, but by the undeniable, overwhelming reality of American abundance and its unexpectedly humane application. With the enemy of captivity came a new and unexpected adversary: boredom. Stripped of purpose, cut off from the war and their homeland, the thousands of young men in these camps became a vast, idle population. American camp commanders, pragmatic and wary of the unrest that idleness could breed, initiated a range of programs to keep the prisoners occupied. There were sports leagues, soccer being the overwhelming favorite, that pitted barracks against barracks in fierce but friendly competition. Libraries were established, stocked with German language books, though heavily censored to remove any Nazi ideology. Prisoners were encouraged to form orchestras, choirs, and theater groups, their performances providing a brief, communal escape from the monotony of camp life. They were even offered educational courses, from English language lessons to vocational training in subjects like woodworking and mechanics. All of these activities served a dual purpose. They maintained order within the camps and, subtly, began to rehumanize men who had been conditioned to see themselves only as cogs in a military machine. But of all the programs, one stood apart. It was a privilege so unexpected, so contrary to their entire experience of war and ideology, that it would prove to be the most disorienting and transformative of all: the movie nights. In halls and repurposed mess tents across the country, 16mm projectors were set up. Attendance was entirely voluntary. Initially, many prisoners were suspicious. Was this a new form of propaganda? A trick? They had been raised in a world where film was a state-controlled weapon, a tool for shaping belief and stealing resolve. The German newsreels they knew were bombastic, scored with Wagnerian music, and filled with images of national strength and enemy depravity. They expected the American equivalent: lectures on the virtues of democracy, newsreels of German cities in flames, or crude caricatures of their leaders. The first films they were shown were, in fact, American propaganda pieces, carefully selected by the War Department. Films like Frank Capra's Why We Fight series were screened to explain the American perspective on the war. But these were often met with cynicism and resistance. The prisoners saw them for what they were: a direct ideological assault, and their mental defenses, honed by years of Nazi messaging, held firm. They scoffed, they heckled, or they simply refused to attend. The real psychological breakthrough came when the camp authorities shifted their strategy, whether by deliberate design or simple pragmatism. They stopped showing overt propaganda and began screening mainstream Hollywood entertainment. Suddenly, the camp movie nights were transformed. The grim, ideological battleground became a portal to another universe. The lights would dim, the projector would flicker to life, and the prisoners would be transported into a world of impossible glamour, freedom, and absurdity. They watched comedies, musicals, and westerns. They saw Clark Gable charm his way through romantic escapades, Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire dance across impossibly polished floors, and the Marx Brothers unleash pure, anarchic chaos on any form of authority they encountered. These films were not lectures. They were windows. They presented a vision of America that was completely at odds with the one painted by Goebbels. It was a place where individuals had agency, where humor could be irreverent and aimed at the powerful, and where life wasn't a constant grim struggle for national destiny, but a pursuit of personal happiness. For a soldier from a totalitarian state, the very concept of a film without an overt political message was bizarre. The idea that a nation at war would spend its resources producing and showing its enemies films about cowboys, detectives, and tap-dancing lovers was utterly alien. It was a cultural Trojan horse, wheeled into the heart of their confinement, and its impact was far more potent than any direct propaganda could ever be. It didn't attack their beliefs head-on. It simply showed them a world where their beliefs were irrelevant. The psychological effect of these screenings was profound, operating on multiple levels. On the surface, the films were pure escapism. For 90 minutes, the men could forget the barbed wire, the monotony of their existence, and the gnawing uncertainty about the fate of their families back home. Laughter became a communal act of release. In the darkened halls, watching a Charlie Chaplin routine or a slapstick comedy, these soldiers of the Third Reich were momentarily stripped of their uniforms and their ideology, reduced to a shared human response. They were no longer the Wehrmacht. They were just an audience, united in amusement. This shared experience began to subtly erode the rigid military hierarchy that had defined their lives. Inside the theater, a private could laugh at the same joke as a sergeant, a shared moment of humanity that transcended rank. The seemingly minor detail was a quiet but persistent challenge to the iron discipline of their training. But beneath the surface entertainment, a more complex ideological erosion was taking place. The very structure and values of Hollywood storytelling acted as an unintentional counter-narrative to Nazism. Consider the classic American Western. The hero was often a lone individual, a man of principle who stood against a corrupt system or a powerful cattle baron. He wasn't fighting for a Führer or the fatherland. He was fighting for his own code of honor, for justice, or to protect the innocent. This celebration of rugged individualism was the philosophical opposite of the Nazi ideal of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, where the individual was subsumed into the collective will of the state. Every time a cowboy rode into the sunset, a lone hero who had made his own destiny, it was a silent sermon on the value of personal freedom. The comedies were perhaps even more subversive. The films of the Marx Brothers, for example, were a gleeful assault on order, authority, and pomposity. They lampooned politicians, academics, and high society with a chaotic energy that was unthinkable in the rigidly controlled culture of Nazi Germany. For men raised to revere authority without question, to see it so thoroughly and hilariously dismantled on screen was a revelation. It suggested that it was not only possible, but perhaps even healthy, to laugh at one's leaders, a concept that bordered on treason in the world they had left behind. Similarly, the romantic comedies and musicals presented a world where the primary concerns were love, courtship, and personal happiness. The on-screen chemistry between a Clark Gable and a Claudette Colbert revolved around a battle of wits between two strong, independent personalities. This stood in stark contrast to the Nazi ideal of women as breeders for the Reich, their roles defined entirely by their service to the state. The American films showcased women who were smart, funny, and pursued their own desires. This humanized the enemy in a way no political speech could. The women on screen were not the demonic caricatures from propaganda posters. They were charming, intelligent, and desirable. The men were not goose-stepping automatons. They were flawed, funny, and relatable. The film systematically replaced the monstrous other created by Goebbels with a cast of recognizable human beings. The process was gradual, almost subliminal. There was no single moment of conversion. Instead, it was a slow, steady drip of an alternate reality. Each film was a new piece of evidence, a new exhibit in a quiet trial being conducted in the minds of the prisoners. The prosecution was the world they saw on screen. The defense was everything they had been taught to believe. And with every laugh, every moment of on-screen romance, every triumph of the lone hero, the case for the defense grew weaker and weaker. The weapon wasn't the message of any single film, but the cumulative impact of the entire Hollywood worldview, a worldview of optimism, individualism, and irreverence that was slowly dissolving the foundations of their ideology. Of course, not every prisoner was won over. Within the camps, a complex social ecosystem developed, and the reaction to the American films became a new dividing line. Hardcore believers, often young men from the Hitler Youth or Waffen-SS units, who had been steeped in the ideology from childhood, remained defiantly resistant. They saw the movies for what they were, a form of cultural poison. To them, the humor was decadent. The focus on individual romance was frivolous, and the lack of a unifying, nationalistic message was a sign of a weak and undisciplined society. These men often organized boycotts of the screenings, enforcing their own brand of ideological purity within the barracks. They would mock those who attended, labeling them as weak or traitors to the cause. For these true believers, the war was not over. It had simply moved inside the wire. They maintained a rigid discipline, held secret meetings, and clung to the hope of a German victory, fueled by the smuggled, optimistic reports from the Reich's propaganda ministry. Their resistance highlighted the deep-seated power of indoctrination. For them, to accept the world presented in a Hollywood film would mean accepting that everything they had fought for, everything their comrades had died for, was based on a lie. It was a psychological chasm too wide and too terrifying for many to cross. For them, maintaining the Nazi worldview was a form of self-preservation, a mental fortress against the bewildering reality of their situation. On the other side of this divide were the older soldiers, men who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and remembered a Germany before Hitler. For them, the seeds of doubt had often been planted long before their capture. They had seen the promises of the party sour into a catastrophic war. For these men, the American movies were not a revelation, but a reminder of a world they had lost, a world where art could exist for art's sake, where personal stories mattered, and where laughter wasn't a state-sanctioned activity. They saw in the films a reflection of the freedoms that had been systematically extinguished in their homeland over the past decade. Caught in the middle was the majority, young, confused, and increasingly disillusioned soldiers. They were not political fanatics, but they had known no other reality than the Third Reich. For this group, the films created a profound cognitive dissonance. How could a nation that produced such light-hearted, optimistic, and technically brilliant films be the monstrous enemy they were supposed to be fighting? How could a society so obviously wealthy and confident be the one destined for collapse? The questions began to pile up, creating cracks in the foundations of their belief. The guards and camp administrators, for their part, largely observed this process from a distance. Their primary mission was security and adherence to the Geneva Convention, not systematic de-Nazification. The film program was more a tool for maintaining morale and preventing unrest than a calculated psychological operation. Yet they could not help but notice the effect. They saw the prisoners eagerly discussing the plot of the latest Western, or humming a tune from a musical. They witnessed the arguments between the hardliners and those whose minds were beginning to open. The camps became unintentional social laboratories, testing the resilience of a totalitarian ideology when confronted with the soft power of popular culture. The contrast between the two worlds was perfectly encapsulated in the experience of the film screening itself. Inside the darkened room, the prisoners were transported to a world of freedom, abundance, and individualism. But when the lights came up, they were back in a prison camp, thousands of miles from home, on the losing side of a devastating war. This jarring transition from the fantasy on screen to the reality of their confinement forced a moment of reflection. The world of Hollywood, once so alien, was starting to seem more real, more desirable than the crumbling world of the Third Reich they had left behind. As the war in Europe ground to its inevitable, bloody conclusion in the spring of 1945, the reality of Germany's defeat could no longer be denied, even by the most ardent Nazis in the camps. The flow of letters from home, which had already been sporadic, slowed to a trickle and then stopped altogether, replaced by a terrifying silence. When news of the final surrender arrived, it was not a shock, but a confirmation of a truth many had been slowly, painfully accepting for months. The end of the fighting, however, did not mean an immediate return home. For the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners in America, a new phase of captivity began, one defined by uncertainty and a dawning comprehension of the sheer scale of the catastrophe that had befallen their nation. It was during this post-war period that the American authorities finally began a more formalized de-Nazification and re-education program. They started showing films that were far more direct and harrowing than the Hollywood fantasies. Prisoners were now required to watch documentaries assembled from captured German footage and the first newsreels from the liberated concentration camps. They were confronted with the undeniable visual evidence of the atrocities that had been committed in their name. For men who had spent years being entertained by Ginger Rogers and the Marx Brothers, this was a brutal and necessary immersion into the horrific truth of the regime they had served. The images of emaciated survivors, of bulldozers pushing piles of bodies into mass graves at Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, were the final, devastating blow to the Nazi myth. There could be no more denial, no more clinging to the idea of a noble cause. The laughter of the movie halls was replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. The world of Hollywood had shown them what a free society could look like. These new films showed them the ultimate consequence of a society without freedom, without morality, without humanity. This one-two punch was psychologically shattering. The soft power of Hollywood had humanized the enemy, America. The hard truth of the documentary footage dehumanized the regime they had once revered. The former had opened their minds, making them receptive to new ideas. The latter forced them to confront the moral bankruptcy of the old ones. It was a powerfully effective sequence, though much of it had been the result of circumstance rather than a grand strategic plan. Repatriation began slowly in late 1945 and continued through 1947. The men who returned to Germany were profoundly changed, not just by the experience of war and defeat, but by their strange interlude in the heart of their enemy's homeland. They stepped off ships into a world they no longer recognized. Their cities were vast landscapes of rubble, their families were scattered or lost, and their nation was a broken, divided pariah. They returned with unbelievable stories that were often met with disbelief or suspicion by a German populace that had endured years of bombing, starvation, and the terror of the war's final days. They spoke of a country with so much food they fed it to their prisoners, of clean barracks and medical care, and, most bizarrely, of going to the movies twice a week. These stories sounded like fantasies, or, worse, like collaborationist propaganda. To a wife who had spent the last year surviving on turnips in a bombed-out cellar, the story of her husband watching a Hollywood musical seemed like a cruel joke. The returning POWs became bearers of a strange and complex truth. They had seen firsthand the industrial power and democratic culture that had defeated them. They carried not just memories of America, but a mental image of what a different kind of society could be. The long-term legacy of this unique chapter of World War II is subtle, yet significant. It cannot be measured in battlefield victories or strategic objectives, but in the quiet, individual transformations that took place in the minds of hundreds of thousands of men. For many of the returning prisoners, their time in America planted a seed. Having seen the alternative to totalitarianism up close, they were less susceptible to the allure of extremist ideologies, whether from the far right or the emerging communist threat in the East. They had experienced a system that, for all its flaws, was built on principles of individual liberty and possessed an almost unimaginable economic dynamism. This first-hand experience provided powerful inoculation against the propaganda that would fuel the coming Cold War. These former soldiers became, in many cases, quiet ambassadors for a different future. They were fathers, factory workers, and community leaders in the nascent West Germany. Their stories, shared over dinner tables and in beer halls, slowly permeated the collective consciousness. The America they described was not the caricature of Nazi propaganda or the idealized savior of official post-war narratives. It was a more nuanced, human place, a country of incredible abundance, surprising decency, and a culture that celebrated laughter and the individual. This grassroots understanding helped lay the groundwork for West Germany's remarkable post-war transformation and its strong alliance with the United States. It fostered an openness to American culture, its music, its fashion, and of course its films, that would define the country for generations. What began as a pragmatic solution to the problem of managing prisoners of war evolved into one of the most effective, if unintentional, psychological campaigns in modern history. It demonstrated that the most powerful ideas are often not those that are shouted, but those that are shown. A Hollywood musical in this context carried more persuasive weight than a political pamphlet. A simple act of kindness from a guard had a greater impact than a re-education lecture. The story of the German POWs in America is a testament to the power of soft power. It reveals that a nation's culture, its values, and its fundamental decency can be weapons as potent as any bomb or tank. It is a reminder that wars are ultimately fought and won not just on the battlefield, but in the complex and contested territory of the human mind. The ultimate victory was not in capturing these soldiers, but in changing them. By treating their enemies with a humanity that their own regime had forsaken, the Americans didn't just win a battle, They won a piece of the future, helping to turn a former adversary into one of their closest and most enduring allies. The whir of the movie projector in those dusty camps echoed far beyond the barbed wire, playing a small but crucial role in healing a shattered continent and shaping the world to come.